I'm Vincent Kozlov, wildlife helicopter pilot stranded in the first month of the Ice Age apocalypse. When the auroras appeared, temperatures plummeted to 62 degrees. My fuel gauge became a countdown to death as I watched civilization freeze beneath my rotors. Now I use my tracking skills to find survivors while evading those who want my helicopter. My expertise saves lives. My choices determine who lives. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Vincent Kozlov, and 30 days ago, I watched the world freeze from the cockpit of my Bell 407 helicopter. The auroras were beautiful, spreading across the Wyoming sky like luminous green and purple curtains. We should have known that beauty can be deadly. None of us understood what was happening at first. Not even someone like me who spent years studying wildlife patterns and environmental changes. My specialized training as a wildlife management helicopter pilot saved my life in ways I never could have anticipated. But even that almost wasn't enough. Before all this, I was tracking wolf packs in the Yellowstone region. It was routine work I'd done hundreds of times before, monitoring migration patterns, population dynamics, and behavioral adaptations. The Bureau of Land Management had contracted me for a 3-week aerial survey to assess how the wolves were responding to recent conservation efforts. My helicopter was equipped with thermal imaging cameras, GPS tracking systems, and specialized radio equipment to communicate with research stations scattered throughout the park. That morning had started like any other. The weather report predicted clear skies with temperatures hovering around 20 degrees, cold, but perfectly normal for January in Wyoming. I remember checking my instruments twice, as I always did, noting that the fuel tanks were filled to capacity, which would give me approximately 4 hours of flight time. The helicopter was in perfect condition, recently serviced and ready for the day's mission. I remember taking off just as dawn broke over the mountains. The sky was clear, a deep blue that promised excellent visibility. My flight plan that day took me to the northern boundaries of Yellowstone, where a particular pack had been exhibiting unusual territorial behaviors. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary as I flew, though I did notice the radio had more static than usual. I adjusted the frequency several times, but the interference persisted. At the time, I dismissed it as atmospheric conditions or perhaps issues with the equipment at the research base. What I couldn't dismiss were the unusual readings on my atmospheric instruments. The temperature was dropping more rapidly than forecasted, and there were strange electromagnetic anomalies that kept triggering warnings on my navigation systems. I'd seen minor equipment glitches before, so I manually recalibrated and continued my mission. That was my first mistake. The signs were there, but I didn't recognize their significance. By midday, the wolves I was tracking began behaving strangely. Normally, they would move with purpose, hunting, resting, or traveling between territories. But now they were moving erratically, almost frantically, all heading south. Years of observation had taught me to recognize normal behavioral patterns, and this wasn't normal. Something was spooking them, something I couldn't see. Then came the auroras. I've seen the northern lights before, but never during daylight and never this far south. They started as faint ribbons of color at the northern horizon, but within an hour they had spread across the entire sky, pulsating with intensities I'd never witnessed. The radio chatter from the research stations became increasingly frantic, before dissolving into static. My satellite phone showed no signal, something that had never happened before in this area. The beauty of those lights was hypnotic. I hovered the helicopter, transfixed by the display, until I noticed something alarming. The temperature gauge was dropping precipitously, 1 degree every few minutes. By the time it hit 0, I knew this wasn't a normal weather phenomenon. Nature doesn't work that way. Temperatures don't plummet 10 degrees in 30 minutes without a catastrophic cause. I tried contacting the main research base again, receiving only fragments of transmissions. Words like magnetic, unprecedented, and emergency protocols came through the static. The last clear message I received was, "All field personnel return to base immediately. This is not a drill." As I changed course toward the research station, I noticed something even more disturbing. The lake below me, a substantial body of, Water that never completely froze even in the depths of winter was developing an ice sheet across its surface, not gradually from the edges as lakes normally freeze, but simultaneously across its entirety, like someone had flipped a switch. The water was crystallizing before my eyes. That's when the emergency broadcast system broke through on all radio frequencies. A calm, automated voice announced a national state of emergency due to extreme and unprecedented climate anomalies. It advised all citizens to seek immediate shelter, conserve resources, and await further instructions. The broadcast repeated, offering no additional information, no explanation of what was happening or how long it would last. I increased altitude, hoping to get better radio reception and a wider view of the situation. What I saw from 1,500 feet will haunt me forever. Highways that had been flowing with traffic now appeared frozen in place, not just covered in snow, but with vehicles stopped in their tracks. Through my binoculars, I could see people abandoning their cars, trudging through rapidly deepening snow. From my vantage point, it looked like a colony of ants scattering from a disturbed hill. The temperature continued dropping. My gauges now read -20 degrees, and ice was forming on the helicopter's exterior, despite the heat from the engine. I checked the fuel gauge, still 3/4 full, but suddenly that didn't seem like nearly enough. In that moment, the needle on that dial represented something much more precious than flight time. It represented survival time. A dark, ominous storm front was approaching from the north, unlike any weather system I'd ever seen. It moved with unnatural speed, swallowing the landscape in white. As a pilot, I've navigated through all kinds of weather, but this was different. This was wrong. That's when I realized this wasn't a freak weather event. This was something none of us were prepared for. I made the decision to abandon my mission and head for the nearest town, hoping to find answers, shelter, and perhaps a way to help others. The research station was too remote, too isolated to be viable in what was clearly becoming a catastrophic situation. Flying toward the small municipal airport near Cody, Wyoming, I tried every communication channel available. Most returned only static, but occasionally I caught fragments of panicked voices, emergency services being overwhelmed, and increasingly desperate civilians. The temperature continued its relentless decline, reaching -30 degrees. According to my instruments, which I was beginning to doubt were even calibrated for such extremes. I noticed ice forming on the rotor blades despite the anti-icing systems running at full capacity. The helicopter was never designed for these conditions, and I was pushing it beyond its operational limits. Every minute in the air increased the risk of mechanical failure, but landing in the wilderness would be a death sentence in the rapidly deteriorating conditions. From the air, I witnessed the first wave of the freeze sweeping across the landscape. Rivers and lakes that should have taken days to freeze were solidifying in hours. Wildlife was moving en masse, instinctively fleeing the cold in a chaotic migration unlike anything documented in modern times. I saw herds of elk alongside predators that would normally be hunting them, all survival instincts redirected toward escaping the cold rather than maintaining natural hierarchies. As I approached Cody, the municipal airport came into view, but it wasn't the organized facility I remembered. Even from a distance, I could see the chaos. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights surrounding the terminal, crowds of people gathering on the tarmac, small aircraft attempting to take off despite the conditions. I established radio contact with the control tower, where a clearly stressed air traffic controller informed me that all commercial flights had been grounded due to the rapidly developing ice storm. The larger airports across the state were already shut down. What had started as a local emergency was evidently spreading across the region, perhaps even the country. Landing at the Cody airport was nerve-wracking. The intense cold had frozen the runway, creating hazardous conditions, and strong gusts of wind threatened to destabilize the helicopter during its descent. I had to rely on every skill I'd developed through years of landing in remote wilderness areas, where landing pads were often nothing more than small clearings in dense forests. As soon as my skids touched down, I was surrounded by airport personnel, local law enforcement, and desperate civilians. Everyone had questions. How bad was it out there? Had I seen any emergency response? Was there any word from the larger cities? I could only report what I'd witnessed, a spreading catastrophe with no apparent end in sight. The small terminal building had been converted into an impromptu emergency shelter. The heating systems were struggling against the plummeting temperatures. Outside, an airport staff were distributing blankets, hot beverages, and what limited food was available from the cafe. The atmosphere was tense but not yet panicked. Many still believed this was a temporary situation, an extreme weather event that would pass in days. I found myself gravitating toward other pilots, comparing notes on conditions and calculating how much longer aircraft could remain operational in such extreme cold. The consensus was grim. Standard aviation fuel begins to gel at extremely low temperatures, and none of our aircraft were designed for Arctic conditions. One by one, the smaller planes were becoming inoperable as their fuel lines froze and electrical systems failed. My helicopter, designed for high-altitude wildlife management in often harsh conditions, was faring better than most. But even it had limitations. The mechanics at the airport estimated that without proper hangar storage and heating, it would become non-functional within 48 hours as lubricants congealed and hydraulic systems lost pressure. That first night at the airport was surreal. The terminal's large windows provided a panoramic view of the storm intensifying outside. The snow fell not in flakes, but in dense, swirling sheets that reduced visibility to near zero. The wind howled, with increasing ferocity, rattling the building's structure and creating snowdrifts that quickly buried smaller vehicles parked outside. Power at the airport was intermittent, supplied by emergency generators that required constant maintenance as their components struggled against the cold. Cell networks were overwhelmed, then failed entirely. Internet connectivity followed shortly after. Our only source of information became battery-powered radios tuned to emergency broadcast frequencies. The reports were fragmentary and increasingly alarming. Major cities across the northern states were experiencing catastrophic infrastructure failures as power grids collapsed under the demand for heating. Natural gas pipelines were developing pressure problems as the ground around them froze to unprecedented depths. Water mains were bursting, leaving entire neighborhoods without running water that quickly froze in the pipes. Most concerning were the reports about the duration of this event. Initial forecasts suggesting days had been replaced with warnings that this could last weeks or even months. The technical explanations involved solar activity, magnetic field disruptions, and cascading atmospheric effects that went beyond my scientific understanding. What was clear, however, was that this wasn't a traditional winter storm. This was potentially an extinction-level event. By morning, the temperature outside had dropped to negative 45 degrees. The airport's inadequate heating system couldn't keep pace, and the interior temperature hovered just above freezing. People huddled together for warmth, their breath visibly condensing in the cold air. What had begun as an orderly shelter was showing the first signs of strain as supplies dwindled and new refugees continued to arrive, many suffering from frostbite and hypothermia after abandoning vehicles on impassable roads. As one of the few with specialized cold weather experience in a potentially operational aircraft, I found myself reluctantly pushed into a leadership role. The airport manager, local sheriff, and senior pilot formed an impromptu crisis committee, and I was asked to join based on my wilderness expertise and potential ability to conduct aerial reconnaissance. That's when I met Dr. Eleanor Chen, a meteorologist who had been stranded at the airport while returning from a conference. Her expertise proved invaluable as she helped translate the technical jargon from emergency broadcasts into understandable terms. According to her analysis, we were experiencing the beginning of what could potentially be a new ice age, triggered by a combination of solar activity and vulnerabilities in Earth's magnetic field. The discussion turned to practical matters. How long could we sustain the growing number of people at the airport? What resources did we have? Could we establish contact with other survivors? And most critically, should we attempt evacuation if the helicopter remained operational? After hours of debate, we decided that my helicopter's remaining fuel would be best used for reconnaissance rather than attempted evacuation. With its limited passenger capacity, evacuating everyone was impossible, and choosing who would go would create dangerous divisions. Instead, I would conduct strategic flights to assess conditions, locate resources, and potentially establish contact with other survivor groups. The first reconnaissance flight was scheduled for the following morning, weather permitting. As dusk fell on the second day, I made my way to the maintenance hangar where my helicopter was stored, protected as much as possible from the elements. I needed to prepare it for flight, checking systems and ensuring it remained operational despite the challenging conditions. That's when I discovered someone had tampered with the fuel lines. In the dim emergency lighting of the hangar, I caught movement behind the aircraft. 3 men, desperate and determined, were attempting to drain fuel from my helicopter's tanks. When confronted, they didn't flee. Instead, they advanced, makeshift weapons in hand. "We're taking the chopper," the apparent leader said. "Nothing personal, pilot, but we've got families south of here. You can stay with these people and freeze, or you can fly us out and take your chances." I stood my ground, aware that the helicopter represented not just my survival but potentially that of everyone at the airport. The confrontation was escalating toward violence when the hangar doors burst open, bringing with it a blast of Arctic air and the airport security chief with 2 deputies, alerted by the maintenance crew about suspicious activity. The would-be thieves were detained, but the incident highlighted a grim reality. As conditions worsened, so would human behavior. Desperation would drive people to acts they'd never normally consider. The helicopter, my skills, and our dwindling resources had just become dangerous liabilities as well as vital assets. That night, as a massive storm approached the airport shelter, we faced difficult decisions. Weather reports indicated this would be the worst system yet, with temperatures predicted to drop below -60 degrees and wind speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour. The airport buildings weren't designed to withstand such conditions, particularly with failing heating systems and dwindling generator fuel. Dr. Chen identified a potential sanctuary, a network of natural caves associated with geothermal activity, approximately 30 miles southeast. These caves, which I'd actually documented during previous wildlife surveys, maintained relatively stable temperatures due to the Earth's internal heat. If we could reach them before the storm hit full force, they might provide shelter more sustainable than our current location. The decision was agonizing. Evacuating meant exposing people to extreme conditions during transit. Staying meant risking structural failure of our current shelter. After intense debate, we decided on a compromise. I would evacuate the most vulnerable. Individuals first, those with medical conditions, the elderly, and young children. As I prepared for this desperate flight, recalculating fuel consumption against the increased weight and deteriorating weather conditions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only at the beginning of this catastrophe. The true test of survival was yet to come. The morning of the evacuation arrived with an ominous silence. The howling winds had temporarily subsided, creating a deceptive calm before the predicted storm. The sky was a strange, sickly yellow-gray, unlike anything I'd seen in all my years of flying. My helicopter sat on the tarmac, its dark silhouette against the snow representing both hope and limitation. 6 passengers was all I could safely carry, along with minimal survival supplies. Dr. Chen had helped identify those most at risk: an elderly man with a heart condition, a pregnant woman in her 3rd trimester, 2 young children whose parents had perished on the road to the airport, and a diabetic man running dangerously low on insulin. The 6th seat went to Dr. Chen herself, whose knowledge of the coming weather patterns and scientific understanding of our situation made her too valuable to lose. Pre-flight checks took twice as long in the extreme cold. Every system needed careful attention, and my fingers, despite thermal gloves, grew numb as I worked. Ice had formed in places I'd never seen it before, requiring improvised de-icing methods using the limited chemicals available at the small municipal airport. The maintenance crew helped as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle against temperatures that no civilian aircraft was designed to endure. As we prepared to depart, a tense crowd gathered around the helicopter. Most wished us well, understanding the necessity of evacuating the most vulnerable first. But I could see the fear in their eyes, the unspoken question of whether I would return for them. The airport security chief maintained order, but the undercurrent of desperation was palpable. "I'll be back with information about the caves," I promised the airport manager as we completed final preparations. If they're viable, we'll begin shuttling more people immediately. The engine startup was concerning. The turbine whined in protest against the cold, taking nearly twice the normal time to reach operational temperatures. Warning lights flickered on the console before reluctantly extinguishing as systems stabilized. Every abnormal sound, every hesitation of the machinery sent pulses of anxiety through me. A mechanical failure now wouldn't just mean an aborted flight. It could mean death for everyone on board. Lifting off from the airport, I immediately encountered the effects of the extreme cold on flight dynamics. The helicopter felt sluggish, less responsive than normal. The air, dense with cold, provided different lift characteristics, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stability. Ice began forming on the windshield despite the defrosting systems running at maximum capacity. From the air, the scale of the catastrophe became even clearer. The town of Cody was dark. No lights visible despite the early dusk of the winter afternoon. Roads had disappeared under snowdrifts tall as houses. Abandoned vehicles created ghostly outlines beneath the white blanket. What few human figures I could see were huddled near buildings, gathering wood from fences and furniture to burn for warmth. As we flew southeast toward the cave system, the weather began deteriorating rapidly. The calm had been temporary, and now the leading edge of the predicted storm was approaching faster than even Dr. Chen had anticipated. Visibility dropped as snow began falling in thick, blinding sheets. The helicopter's frame vibrated with increasing turbulence, causing fearful glances between the passengers. "How much longer?" Dr. Chen asked, her scientific composure showing cracks of anxiety. 20 minutes if we maintain course, I replied, not mentioning that maintaining course was becoming increasingly difficult as navigation instruments struggled against electromagnetic interference. I was relying more on visual landmarks and memory than technology, a dangerous proposition in near whiteout conditions. 15 minutes into the flight, the first serious warning light illuminated the cockpit. Ice was accumulating on the tail rotor despite the anti-icing systems. The helicopter began a subtle yaw to the right that required constant correction. Then the second warning. Engine temperature fluctuations indicating potential fuel line. Freezing. I faced an impossible choice. Continue toward the caves through worsening conditions with failing systems, or attempt to return to the airport. Neither option promised safety. Pushing forward seemed marginally better than turning back into the approaching storm front. But both paths led through increasingly dangerous flying conditions. That's when I spotted something through a momentary break in the snowfall. A road that I recognized from previous surveys, and alongside it, a small ranger station used during summer months. It wasn't the geothermal caves we were aiming for, but it was a solid structure that might provide temporary shelter until the worst of the storm passed. I announced my decision to divert to the ranger station, receiving no objections from the increasingly terrified passengers. The landing was one of the most challenging of my career. Zero visibility, and the final approach required hovering by feel alone, setting down on what I hoped was level ground rather than a snow-concealed obstacle. The skids touched down with a crunch rather than the usual gentle settling. We had landed, but the helicopter immediately began to list to one side. I shut down the engine with practiced urgency, aware that any further stress on the systems could make a restart impossible. "Everyone out, quickly but carefully," I instructed, helping the elderly man with his oxygen tank while Dr. Chen assisted the pregnant woman. The children clung to each other, wide-eyed with fear but remarkably composed given the circumstances. The diabetic man moved sluggishly, his condition already affecting his coordination. Outside, the full force of the cold hit us with physical impact. The temperature was now beyond what conventional thermometers could register, somewhere below -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed skin would freeze in seconds, not minutes. We moved as a tight group toward the ranger station, which thankfully was unlocked. Standard protocol for remote wilderness buildings where stranded hikers might need emergency shelter. The interior was basic but sound. One main room with a wood stove, small kitchen area, bunk beds, and most importantly, an emergency supply cabinet that contained first aid equipment, some preserved food, and hand crank emergency radios. No electricity, no running water, but solid walls and a roof that would withstand the storm far better than the airport's glass-walled terminal. Our first priority was heat. While the others organized the limited supplies and assessed our situation, I broke apart wooden furniture to start a fire in the stove. Years of wilderness experience had taught me efficient fire-starting techniques, knowledge that now meant the difference between life and death. Soon, a small but growing fire began to warm the space. Dr. Chen attempted to establish contact using the emergency radio, but without success. The electromagnetic disturbances affecting my helicopter's instruments were apparently interfering with all radio frequencies as well. We were truly isolated, cut off from all communication with the outside world. As night fell, the storm reached full intensity. The wind sounded like a living creature, howling and clawing at the walls of our shelter. Snow piled against the windows until they were completely covered, plunging us into a darkness broken only by firelight. The temperature inside remained dangerously low despite the stove's efforts, forcing us to huddle together for warmth. I found myself unable to rest, constantly moving between checking on the helicopter outside, now nearly buried in snow, maintaining the fire, and assessing our supplies. The responsibility for these lives weighed heavily. My decision to divert to the ranger station rather than continue to the caves might have saved us from an aerial disaster, but it had also stranded us with limited resources in a location unknown to those at the airport. By morning, though the concept of morning had little meaning in the perpetual twilight of the storm, we faced new challenges. The diabetic man's condition was deteriorating rapidly without insulin. One of the children had developed a concerning cough. Our food supplies, adequate for a temporary stay, would not sustain 6 people for more than a few days. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified overnight. Stepping outside to check the helicopter required tethering myself to the building with rope to prevent becoming lost in the whiteout merely feet from safety. The helicopter was now largely hidden beneath snow, and I had to dig to access the cargo compartment where additional emergency supplies were stored. During this expedition, I made a discovery that added a new layer of concern. Large animal tracks circled the building and helicopter, too large for typical wolf prints and showing a pattern of movement I didn't recognize from any wildlife native to the region. Something adapted to these extreme conditions was hunting, in the storm, aware of our presence and potentially assessing us as prey. Back inside, I kept this information to myself, not wanting to add to the group's anxiety. Instead, I focused on our most immediate problem, the need to establish contact with the airport to report our location and situation. The hand crank radio remained ineffective regardless of frequency, but I remembered something from my helicopter's equipment that might help. My wildlife tracking work often took me to remote locations where conventional communications failed. For this reason, my helicopter was equipped with a specialized emergency beacon developed for wilderness research teams. It transmitted on multiple frequencies simultaneously and was designed to penetrate interference that would block standard radio signals. If I could retrieve it from the helicopter and get it operational, we might be able to signal not just the airport but any search and rescue assets that might be functioning. The journey to the helicopter and back was nightmarish. The cold had intensified beyond anything I'd experienced, piercing my insulated clothing as if it were thin cotton. The wind created whiteout conditions so severe that I could barely see, my hand in front of my face. Only the guide rope prevented me from becoming hopelessly lost between the ranger station and the helicopter. Extracting the emergency beacon required clearing packed snow from the equipment compartment with bare hands, as tools were too cumbersome for the delicate work. By the time I retrieved it, my fingers were numb despite gloves, and frostbite was a real concern. The return journey seemed to take hours rather than minutes, each step a battle against wind that physically pushed against my body. Inside the station, Dr. Chen immediately recognized the significance of the beacon. Together, we worked to activate it, using the hand crank generator to provide the necessary power. The device lit up, its display showing transmission in progress. Whether anyone would receive the signal remained uncertain, but it represented our best hope of rescue. 3 days passed in the ranger station. The storm continued unabated, defying all normal weather patterns that Dr. Chen had ever studied. Our food supplies dwindled despite careful rationing. The diabetic man slipped into a coma, beyond our limited medical ability to help. The elderly man's breathing became increasingly labored as the cold aggravated his heart condition. The pregnant woman experienced contractions that terrified all of us, given our complete lack of obstetric supplies or knowledge. On the fourth morning, I awoke to a strange sensation: silence. The constant howl of wind had ceased. Looking out the single window we had kept clear of snow, I saw a transformed world. The storm had passed, at least temporarily, revealing a landscape so alien it was barely recognizable. Snow drifts created undulating waves higher than a person. The sun, weak and distant, cast an eerie blue light over everything, and the cold remained, perhaps even more intense in the still air. Most concerning was the helicopter, now visible again with the improved conditions. The snow covering had partially melted and refrozen during temperature fluctuations, encasing critical components in solid ice. Getting it operational again would require tools and conditions we didn't have access to at the ranger station. I made the difficult decision to attempt the journey to the geothermal caves on foot. According to my calculations and memory of the area, they were approximately 7 miles southeast of our current position. Under normal conditions, an easy hike of a few hours. Under these conditions, a potentially fatal journey. The group discussion was tense. Some argued that staying put with the emergency beacon active was safer than risking exposure. Others pointed out that our supplies wouldn't last much longer, and the medical situations were becoming critical. In the end, the decision came down to a grim calculation: certain slow deterioration at the ranger station versus the risk of immediate death on the journey balanced against the potential salvation of the geothermal warmth. We prepared as best we could. Multiple layers of clothing for everyone. Food divided and carried by those still strong enough. The emergency beacon repacked to continue transmission while mobile. A makeshift travois constructed from ranger station furniture to transport the comatose diabetic man. Improvised snow goggles made from paper with narrow slits to prevent snow blindness. The journey began promisingly. The clear weather held, and the snow, while deep, had a frozen crust that mostly supported our weight. We moved in single file, taking turns breaking trail at the front where the exertion was greatest. Progress was slow but steady, and morale cautiously improved with each mile successfully covered. That changed abruptly when the pregnant woman's water broke. There was no warning, no gradual onset of consistent contractions. One moment we were moving steadily, the next she was on her knees in the snow, face contorted in pain, amniotic fluid freezing almost instantly where it fell. We had no choice but to stop. Returning to the ranger station was impossible given her condition and our limited supplies. Continuing to the caves seemed equally impossible with birth imminent. We quickly constructed a snow shelter, a technique I'd learned during wilderness survival training, but never expected to use for an emergency delivery. Dr. Chen took charge of the medical situation despite having no obstetric experience. Her scientific knowledge combined with the first aid information from our emergency supplies provided our only guidance. The rest of us maintained the shelter, kept watch for the strange predators I'd seen signs of, and prepared for a newborn that would be entering the world in conditions humans were never meant to endure. The labor lasted 6 agonizing hours. The woman's screams echoed across the frozen landscape, a sound so human and vulnerable against the inhuman cold that it affected even my professional detachment. When the baby finally emerged, a girl, impossibly, small and fragile, the silence that followed her first cry was deafening. Miraculously, both mother and child survived the birth. We swaddled the newborn in every spare piece of clothing we could sacrifice, creating an insulated bundle that the mother held close to her body for crucial warmth. But our situation had become even more desperate. We now had an infant whose survival in these temperatures was measured in hours without substantial shelter and heat. As we prepared to continue our journey with this new, vulnerable member, one of the children spotted something in the distance, movement against the white landscape. At first, I feared it was the predators whose tracks I'd seen, but as the figures drew closer, I recognized human shapes heavily bundled against the cold. They approached cautiously, weapons visible but not aimed directly at us. 5 individuals traveling with purpose and equipment that suggested preparation rather than desperate flight. Their leader stepped forward, lowering the face covering that protected against the cold. "We picked up your emergency beacon," he said, his voice muffled by the multiple layers. "We've been tracking you since you left the ranger station." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by suspicion. Who were these people? How did they have the capability to receive our emergency signal when all normal communications had failed? And most importantly, could they be trusted? The leader seemed to recognize my caution. "I'm Dr. Marcus Reed, geologist. We have a research station established in the cave system you were heading toward. We've been monitoring the magnetic anomalies since before they triggered this freeze." Dr. Chen stepped forward, recognition in her eyes. "Reed from the University of Wyoming? I've read your papers on geothermal activity in the Yellowstone region." The connection established a tentative trust. Dr. Reed's team quickly assessed our medical emergencies, producing actual medical supplies including insulin for our diabetic companion. They had arrived with sleds and proper cold weather gear that made movement across the snow more efficient. As we prepared to travel with them to the cave system, I pulled Dr. Reed aside. "You knew something was coming, didn't you? That's why you were established in the caves already." His expression was grim. "We had theories, mathematical models suggesting a possible polar shift triggered by solar activity, but nobody predicted this speed or severity. We expected years of gradual change, not days of catastrophic collapse." That admission sent a chill through me, colder than the air temperature. If the scientific community had been caught this unprepared, what hope did ordinary citizens have? What did that mean for the billions of people worldwide facing the same conditions without specialized knowledge or equipment? As we set off toward the caves with our rescuers, I couldn't shake the thought that we might be among an incredibly small percentage of humanity that would survive this event. The helicopter I'd been so concerned about now seemed like a relic of a vanished world, as obsolete as its pilot might soon become without adaptation to this new reality. The journey to the caves was arduous, despite our improved equipment and guides. The temperature continued to drop as the sun disappeared below the horizon, reaching levels that made breathing painful as the moisture in our lungs crystallized with each exhalation. The diabetic man, revived somewhat with proper medication, still required constant monitoring. The newborn, despite our best efforts, developed a bluish tinge to her extremities that worried everyone. Dr. Reed maintained a punishing pace, clearly aware that our survival depended on reaching adequate shelter before nightfall fully descended. His team moved with practiced efficiency, demonstrating adaptation to the extreme conditions that gave me hope that humans could survive this new ice age, at least in small numbers with proper knowledge and equipment. As we climbed a snow-covered ridge, Dr. Reed paused, pointing ahead. In the gathering darkness, I could just make out a dark opening in the white landscape, the entrance to the cave system. But more surprising was the faint glow emanating from within. Artificial light. Electricity still functioning when the rest of civilization had gone dark. "We've tapped the geothermal activity for power," Dr. Reed explained, noting my expression. "It's limited but stable, enough to maintain basic operations and life support." As we approached the cave entrance, I became aware of something else. Warmth. Not the blistering heat of a normal building, but a temperature perhaps just above freezing, which after days in -60 felt like tropical paradise. I removed my gloves, feeling sensation return painfully to my fingers, watching as the others did the same, expressions of relief and disbelief visible even through their frost-covered facial coverings. We were led deeper into the cave system, passing through a makeshift airlock that preserved the temperature differential between outside and in. Beyond this point, the cave opened into a larger chamber where evidence of longer-term habitation was visible. Organized supply areas, sleeping quarters constructed from what looked like expedition tents, scientific equipment arranged on folding tables, and approximately 20 other people engaged in various activities. Dr. Reed introduced us as his team helped the most vulnerable members of our group, toward a designated medical area. "Welcome to Thermal Base Alpha," he said. "One of possibly dozens of similar shelters established across the region when we first detected the magnetic anomalies. It's not comfortable, but it's sustainable. The geothermal activity maintains temperatures above freezing year-round, provides limited electrical generation, and created cave systems extensive enough to house small communities." As I watched our companions receive proper medical attention, including the newborn being placed in what appeared to be an improvised incubator, a new realization struck me. My focus had been so narrowly aimed at immediate survival that I hadn't considered the long-term implications. This wasn't a temporary crisis that we would emerge from to rebuild our previous lives. This was potentially a fundamental, permanent shift in Earth's climate that would require completely new ways of living. Dr. Reed confirmed this fear when he took Dr. Chen and me aside for a more detailed briefing on their scientific findings. The data they had collected indicated that the magnetic disruption wasn't stabilizing, it was intensifying. The cold would continue to deepen, the storms would grow more severe, and the habitable regions of Earth would contract further, concentrated around geothermal hotspots and certain equatorial regions. "How many will survive this?" I asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Reed's expression remained stoic. "Global population reduction will be significant, but humanity will endure, adapted to new circumstances. Those who find sustainable shelter, who possess useful skills, who can overcome the initial chaos to establish new communities, they'll be the foundation of whatever comes next." I thought about the people I'd left behind at the airport who were expecting me to return with information about the caves, about my helicopter, now likely permanently disabled by the ice and cold, about the responsibility I still carried to help others with my specialized knowledge. "The storm's passed for now," I said, my decision forming even as I spoke. "I need to get back to the airport. There are people there who need to know about this place, who could contribute valuable skills and knowledge." Dr. Reed shook his head. "The next storm front is already approaching from the north. Satellite imagery showed it before we lost communication with the network. It's bigger than the last one. Anyone exposed when it hits won't survive." "Then I need to reach them before it arrives," I insisted. I made a promise to return. Dr. Reed studied me for a long moment before responding. "We have snow vehicles, designed for these conditions. Limited fuel, but enough for a return trip to the airport and back if you don't delay. But understand, we can't accommodate hundreds of people here. The resources won't sustain it." "I understand," I replied, though the implications of that constraint, having to choose who would receive sanctuary and who would not, was a burden I wasn't sure I could bear. As I prepared for this desperate mission with equipment far better, suited to the conditions than anything available at the airport, I considered what awaited me there. Would organized civilization still exist? Or would desperation have already descended into conflict? Would I find survivors to save? Or a freezing graveyard? And how would I choose who deserved the limited salvation the caves could offer? Answers to these questions would shape not just my future, but potentially the future of human society in this new frozen world. As I climbed aboard the specialized snow vehicle, I glanced back at the cave entrance, at the faint glow of sustainable heat and power, at the thin thread of hope it represented. Then I turned toward the endless white expanse, toward the airport and whatever remained of the world I once knew. The snow vehicle Dr. Reed provided was unlike anything I'd operated before. A hybrid between a snowmobile and a small tank, with enclosed cabin space, treads designed for extreme conditions, and insulation that maintained survivable interior temperatures despite the killing cold outside. The controls were intuitive enough for someone with my mechanical background, though the handling was different from my helicopter's precise responsiveness. Before departing, I studied satellite imagery captured before communications failed. The airport was approximately 15 miles northwest of the cave system, a journey that would have taken days on foot, but might be possible in under 2 hours with this vehicle. The immediate challenge was navigation. The landscape had been so transformed by snow and ice that familiar landmarks were unrecognizable. Dr. Reed provided a specialized compass adjusted for the magnetic anomalies and a rudimentary map showing terrain features substantial enough to remain identifiable. Their scientific team had documented significant magnetic shifts that rendered standard navigation equipment useless, requiring constant recalibration based on observed star positions. Even the sun's position had become an unreliable reference point due to atmospheric distortions. "The storms follow patterns," he explained before I departed. "This calm is temporary, perhaps 6 hours before the next front arrives. If you're not back by then, you won't make it back at all." The journey outward was eerily quiet. The snow vehicle's electric engine produced minimal sound, creating an unsettling silence broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the treads. The landscape had been scoured into alien formations by wind, smooth dunes in some areas, jagged ice sculptures in others. Occasionally, I passed evidence of the world before, the roof of a cabin protruding from a snowdrift, the skeletal branches of trees bent low under ice weight, the barely visible outline of a buried truck. What struck me most was the complete absence of wildlife. Wyoming had been teeming with animals: elk, moose, wolves, eagles, creatures adapted to winter conditions. Now there was nothing visible, no tracks breaking the smooth snow surface, no movement against the white stillness. Either they had migrated beyond this region seeking warmer temperatures, died from the extreme cold, or adapted in ways that made them invisible to casual observation. Halfway to the airport, I encountered the first sign of human activity: a makeshift camp erected in the hollow created by 2 fallen trees. The remnants of a fire, long extinguished, and torn fabric that might have been a tent suggested recent occupation. But there were no people, no bodies, only abandoned supplies half buried in snow. Someone had either been forced to flee quickly or had succumbed to the cold while away from shelter. I paused briefly, searching for any clues about who had been there or where they might have gone, but found nothing definitive. As I approached the general vicinity of the airport, navigation became increasingly difficult. Snow had completely transformed the landscape, burying roads and smaller structures entirely. What had been a valley was now a relatively flat plain of white. I relied on larger features: the distinctive shape of a particular mountain range to the west, the curve of what had been the river before it froze solid. Then I saw it, the control tower still standing, a single dark vertical line against the white horizon. The rest of the airport buildings were mostly buried under snow, with only portions of roof lines and the occasional wall visible. There was no movement, no sign of the hundreds of people who had been sheltering there when I left. My stomach tightened with dread at what I might find. Drawing closer, I noticed something alarming. Smoke rose from multiple locations around the airport perimeter. Not the organized smoke of heating fires, but the thick black plumes that suggested buildings burning despite the cold. As I crested a final ridge that offered a clear view of the airport grounds, the scene before me confirmed my worst fears. The terminal building where most people had been sheltering was partially collapsed, its glass walls shattered by either extreme temperatures or human conflict. Smaller outbuildings were actively burning, the fires struggling against the cold but consuming available materials nonetheless. And there was movement, not the organized activity of a functioning community, but the chaotic motion of scattered individuals and small groups scavenging through the wreckage or engaged in what appeared to be armed confrontation. I stopped the snow vehicle at a distance, using binoculars to assess the situation more carefully before approaching. What I observed was the aftermath of what must have been a catastrophic social collapse. The airport had devolved into several competing factions fighting over dwindling resources. Some had barricaded themselves in the remaining airport structures, while others had established improvised shelters from aircraft parts and building materials. Armed individuals patrolled territories with clear hostile intent toward outsiders. Most concerning was the condition of the people visible through my binoculars. Even from a distance, I could see signs of severe frostbite, malnutrition, and exposure. Many moved with the sluggish gait of hypothermia victims. Others didn't move at all, their bodies left where they had fallen in the snow. The community I had left behind had fractured and was dying. I faced an immediate dilemma: Driving directly into this situation would likely result in being attacked for the snow vehicle and supplies. However, I couldn't identify any single authority figure or organized group to approach diplomatically. My promise to return with information about Sanctuary now seemed hopelessly naive. Even if I could somehow gather all survivors, their numbers far exceeded what the cave system could accommodate. After careful observation, I identified what appeared to be the most organized and least aggressive group, established in what remained of the maintenance hangar where my helicopter had been stored. I approached cautiously, using a route that kept me visible while maintaining distance to prevent feeling threatened. As expected, armed individuals emerged from the hangar as I drew near. I stopped the vehicle and exited slowly, hands visible, calling out my identity. Recognition came. Gradually, then a flurry of activity as word spread that the helicopter pilot had returned. I was quickly surrounded and escorted inside the hangar, which had been converted into a relatively functional shelter, with improvised heating and organized sleeping areas. The airport manager had survived and maintained leadership of this group, approximately 40 people who had banded together when conflict erupted. He explained what had happened after my departure, how hope had gradually faded as hours stretched into days without my return, how supplies had dwindled faster than anticipated as more refugees arrived seeking shelter, and how the first violence broke out when the emergency generator finally failed, plunging the terminal into darkness and killing the heating system. "We thought you were dead," he said simply, "or that you'd found something better and weren't coming back for us." I explained about the ranger station, the storm, and finally the cave system with its sustainable heat and power. Hope flickered in their expressions, quickly replaced by calculation as they realized what my return meant. Possible escape from their deteriorating situation. The manager asked the question I'd been dreading. "How many can you take back with you?" The snow vehicle could transport 8 people besides myself if tightly packed. The cave system, according to Dr. Reed, could perhaps accommodate 30 additional people before resource constraints became critical. Looking at the 40 survivors just in this hangar, not counting other groups scattered around the airport, the math was devastating. Before I could answer, alarm shouts from their sentries interrupted our conversation. Another faction had observed my arrival and was mounting what appeared to be an organized assault on the hangar, presumably to capture the snow vehicle. The manager's group prepared for defense, distributing limited weapons and barricading entrances. "Is there another way out?" I asked urgently, knowing that the snow vehicle represented the only realistic chance of reaching the caves before the next storm. A mechanic indicated a partially obscured service door on the far side of the hangar. "They probably don't know about it. It's mainly used for fuel delivery, not visible from the main terminal." I made a rapid decision, one that would haunt me regardless of outcome. I asked the manager to identify 8 individuals whose skills would be most valuable for establishing a new community: medical personnel, engineers, those with survival or agricultural knowledge. There was no time for democratic process or lengthy evaluation. Choices had to be made immediately before the attacking group breached the hangar's defenses. The selection process was agonizing. People understood what was happening, who was being chosen for survival and who would be left behind. Families were separated as individuals with critical skills were selected while their loved ones were not. Some refused to leave without family members, requiring immediate substitutions. Others pleaded desperately to be included, citing skills or knowledge that might prove valuable. Through it all, the sounds of the assault grew closer: shouting, the crash of improvised battering rams against metal doors, occasional gunshots. Within minutes, that felt like hours. We had 8 selected individuals gathered at the service exit with minimal personal belongings. The manager was among them, having been unanimously identified by his group as possessing leadership skills essential for establishing a new community. As we prepared to slip out to the snow vehicle, he addressed those being left behind, promising to return if possible with additional transportation, or at least information about other potential shelter locations. The departure through the service door was tense but initially successful. We moved as a tight group through swirling snow toward where I had parked the vehicle, approximately 200 yards from the hangar. We had covered half that distance. when shouts behind us indicated we'd been spotted by members of the attacking faction. What followed was a desperate race through knee-deep snow, burdened by people already weakened from days of inadequate nutrition and warmth. 2 of our group fell behind despite assistance, their strength simply insufficient for the exertion required. The manager made the brutal decision to continue with those who could keep pace, knowing that stopping for stragglers would doom everyone. We reached the snow vehicle with pursuers less than 50 yards behind. The loading process was chaotic but efficient, driven by survival instinct. As I engaged the engine, the first attackers reached us, attempting to climb aboard or block our departure. The manager, positioned by the rear hatch, made the horrible choice to use his weapon, firing warning shots that escalated into direct confrontation when the attackers didn't retreat. The snow vehicle lurched forward as I navigated through the chaotic scene, trying to avoid injuring people while still ensuring our escape. The last image I had of the airport was through the rearview camera, people fighting in our wake, the maintenance hangar now clearly breached and being ransacked, small fires spreading to new structures as various factions took advantage of the chaos to attack rivals. As we put distance between ourselves and the airport, the physical relief of escape was overshadowed by the psychological weight of what we'd just experienced. 6 individuals plus the manager and myself had made it aboard, 6 out of hundreds, who had been at the airport originally. The mathematics of survival in this new world were merciless, and I had been forced to be its calculator. The journey back toward the caves was conducted in near silence, each person processing their individual trauma and survivor's guilt. I focused on navigation, using the compass and my memory of landmarks from the outbound journey, acutely aware that the weather was already changing. The clear sky was giving way to increasing cloud cover from the north, the leading edge of the storm Dr. Reed had warned about. Approximately halfway to the caves, we encountered the first setback. The snow vehicle's battery indicator showed unexpected power depletion, likely due to the extra weight and the high-speed escape. We would need to reduce speed to conserve remaining power, extending our journey time dangerously close to the storm's projected arrival. Then came the second, more immediate threat. The tracks I'd observed earlier at the ranger station but hadn't seen during my outbound journey suddenly appeared in our path. Massive paw prints larger than any wolf I'd documented in my wildlife work, moving in a hunting pattern that was alarmingly intelligent, and they were fresh, pressed into snow that had fallen since my earlier passing. I alerted the others to watch for movement, not wanting to cause panic but needing extra vigilance. The manager, who had hunting experience, positioned himself near a viewport with his weapon ready. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly as the storm approached, reaching levels where even these adapted predators should be seeking shelter, yet the tracks indicated active hunting behavior. When the attack came, it was not from the direction we were watching. The first indication was a heavy impact against the roof of the vehicle, powerful enough to dent the metal inward. Glimpsed through viewports was a creature that defied easy classification, wolf-like in basic form but much larger, with a thick white coat that rendered it nearly invisible against the snow, and anatomical adaptations suggesting evolutionary changes that should have taken thousands of years, not weeks. The creature retreated after its initial attack failed to breach the vehicle, but we soon realized it wasn't alone. At least 3 similar animals flanked our position, moving with coordinated purpose that indicated pack behavior of frightening sophistication. They were herding us, I realized with biologist clarity, directing our movement away from our intended path and toward a particular area ahead. I had to make an immediate choice, maintain our original course, and risk continued attacks that might eventually damage critical vehicle components, or follow the path of least resistance where the creatures seemed to be directing us. Either option carried significant risk, but the battery indicator's continued decline made any delay or additional power expenditure potentially fatal. I chose to follow their apparent steering, watching our navigation carefully to ensure we didn't deviate too far from our destination. The creatures continued flanking us but ceased direct attacks as we complied with their apparent intent. The manager kept his weapon ready but held fire, understanding as I did that conserving ammunition might prove crucial. The mystery of their behavior was resolved when they guided us to a particular valley between 2 ridgelines. There, Partially protected from wind in a natural depression was a gathering of approximately 20 human survivors around a struggling fire. The creatures, having delivered us to this location, retreated to watching positions on higher ground. These survivors had established a tenuous camp using equipment and supplies salvaged from various sources. They appeared better adapted to the conditions than those at the airport, wearing layered clothing clearly modified for extreme cold and having constructed snow shelters similar to traditional igloo designs. As we approached, they showed caution but not outright hostility. Their leader introduced herself as Dr. Diana Frost, a veterinarian who had been working with wildlife conservation teams in the region when the freeze began. She explained the astonishing relationship they had developed with the adapted wolf pack, not domestication exactly, but a mutual cooperation based on shared survival needs. The wolves had developed intelligence accelerated by the extreme environmental pressure, while the humans provided aspects of problem-solving the animals couldn't manage. They bring us people they find alive in the snow, Dr. Frost explained. I think they recognize that isolated humans die, while groups survive. They're effectively collecting survivors to strengthen our group, which in turn makes us better hunting partners for them. This symbiotic relationship had allowed both species to survive where neither might have alone. The humans provided fire, tool use, and medical care when the animals were injured. The wolves provided hunting prowess, superior navigation in whiteout, conditions and warning of approaching threats or storms through sensory capabilities humans lacked. Dr. Frost's group had been nomadic, following geothermal indicators that the wolves somehow sensed, providing them with locations where the ground remained warm enough to prevent freezing to death during rest periods. Their immediate destination had been a suspected geothermal hotspot to the southeast, almost certainly the same cave system we were heading toward. The manager and I conferred briefly about this unexpected development. These survivors possessed valuable adaptation knowledge and a relationship with the wolf pack that represented an evolutionary breakthrough. Their skills complemented those of our airport group and potentially those at the cave system. Together, they represented a more viable community than any group alone. However, our vehicle could not transport 20 additional people, and the approaching storm would kill anyone left exposed. Dr. Frost proposed a solution. The wolves could guide foot travel through the storm using paths only they could sense. If we provided the location of the caves as destination, it was a desperate plan with significant risk, but no alternatives presented themselves. We divided our resources. 4 of our original group would remain with Dr. Frost's people, including those with medical and survival skills that might help during the journey. The manager and I, along with 2 engineers from the airport, would continue in the snow vehicle to the caves, where we would prepare for the larger group's arrival and potentially send back additional transportation if the storm allowed. Before separating, Dr. Frost approached me privately. The wolves have been behaving strangely the past few days, she said. They're agitated about something to the north beyond what the storm explains. They keep trying to move us south, faster than we can travel. It's as if they sense something coming that frightens even them. This warning lingered in my mind as we departed, watching through rear view ports as Dr. Frost's group prepared for their journey, the white wolves moving restlessly around their perimeter. What could frighten creatures that had so successfully adapted to apocalyptic conditions? What worse threat could be approaching from the north? The snow vehicle's battery indicator continued its decline as we pushed toward the caves, the storm visibly building behind us. Navigation became increasingly challenging as wind picked up, creating ground blizzard conditions that obscured landmarks. We were operating on minimum power to extend range, which meant minimal heating inside the vehicle. The cold penetrated gradually, our breath fogging, then crystallizing on interior surfaces. 4 miles from the caves, with the battery indicator showing critical levels, we experienced the first mechanical failure. The left tread seized, causing the vehicle to veer sharply and nearly topple into a snow-filled ravine. The engineers immediately identified the problem. Hydraulic fluid had thickened beyond operational viscosity as the vehicle's temperature dropped, eventually freezing components in place. Repairs were theoretically possible but would require external work in conditions that would cause frostbite on exposed skin within minutes. We faced the same impossible choice that had defined every moment since the freeze began: risk death attempting repairs, or risk death continuing with failing. Equipment. The storm's leading edge was now clearly visible on the horizon, a wall of white advancing with unnatural speed. One of the engineers volunteered to attempt the repair, understanding fully what exposure to the elements would mean. The manager and I helped him prepare, wrapping every inch of skin in available insulating materials and planning the repair sequence to minimize exposure time. Even with these precautions, he would have minutes at most before the cold incapacitated him. The repair attempt was both heroic and horrifying to witness. The engineer worked with desperate efficiency, his movements growing visibly stiffer as the cold penetrated his protection. When he finally retreated into the vehicle, the damage was evident: blackened fingertips and facial tissue where exposure had occurred despite precautions. But the tread was functioning again, at least partially, enough to restore mobility if not optimal performance. We continued toward the caves with the engineer now requiring urgent medical attention, the vehicle limping on damaged treads, and the storm overtaking us with each passing minute. The first snow squalls reduced visibility to mere yards, forcing me to navigate almost entirely by compass and the crude map. The temperature dropped so rapidly that the vehicle's external thermometer ceased functioning, the display simply showing error where a numerical value should have been. When the caves finally appeared through the strengthening storm, the relief was overwhelming but brief. We were still outside, still vulnerable, with a vehicle on the verge of complete failure and a storm that would kill us within minutes of exposure. The final approach would test every skill I had developed as a pilot and wilderness survivor. The snow vehicle died completely 30 yards from the cave entrance, its battery depleted and mechanical systems frozen. There was no choice but to attempt the final distance on foot, carrying the increasingly unresponsive engineer between us. We wrapped him as completely as possible, covered every inch of our own skin, and stepped out into cold so intense it hurt to breathe. The 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. The wind had strengthened to the point where forward progress required leaning into it at a sharp angle. The snow struck exposed portions of face with the impact of sand, abrading skin already, taut with freezing. Each step required conscious effort against snow that sometimes supported weight and sometimes gave way to knee-deep drifts. 20 yards from the entrance, the manager stumbled, momentarily losing his grip on the engineer. 10 yards from safety, my own legs began to fail, muscles seizing from cold despite multiple layers of insulation. 5 yards from the entrance, figures emerged from the cave, Dr. Reed's people, risking their own safety to assist our final approach. The transition from killing cold to the relative warmth of the cave entrance was so extreme that it caused physical pain, a burning sensation, as circulation attempted to return to extremities. Medical personnel immediately took charge of the engineer, whose condition was critical but potentially survivable with their equipment and expertise. The manager and I were helped deeper into the cave system, our outer layers removed as the relative warmth made them more hindrance than help. Dr. Reed was waiting in the main chamber, his expression grim as he assessed our condition and received our report. The news about Dr. Frost's group potentially arriving was met with concern about resource constraints but recognition of the value their adaptations and wolf partnerships could bring. Preparations began immediately to receive them if they managed to navigate through the storm. As I recovered from the journey warmed by geothermal heat and proper hydration, my thoughts turned to those still making their way through the growing storm, Dr. Frost's group and their wolf guides and beyond, them. The scattered survivors across the freezing landscape, each fighting their individual battles against cold and despair. The Ice Age had only just begun, and already humanity was being forced to evolve or perish, forming new alliances even with other species facing the same existential threat. From the cave entrance came the sound of the storm reaching full intensity, a howling that mimicked the wolves but with mindless destructive force rather than intelligent purpose. And somewhere in that storm were people moving south, guided by creatures that until recently had been predators rather than partners, all fleeing something approaching from the north that frightened even these newly evolved hunters. I joined Dr. Reed at a monitoring station where rudimentary equipment tracked weather patterns and magnetic fluctuations. The displays confirmed what we could hear. This storm was worse than its predecessors, with temperatures and wind speeds exceeding anything previously recorded, but more concerning was a pattern of magnetic anomalies moving southward ahead of the storm, readings that made no scientific sense according to known physical laws. "It's as if the magnetic poles aren't just shifting," Dr. Reed said quietly. "They're fragmenting, creating mobile fields that interact with any conductive material. The implications for any remaining technology or infrastructure are catastrophic." I thought about Dr. Frost's warning, about the wolves' fear of something approaching from the north. Perhaps they sensed these magnetic anomalies, perhaps they understood something about this changed world that our human senses couldn't detect. As the storm raged outside our sanctuary, I wondered what other evolutionary adaptations might emerge, what new threats and possibilities awaited in this transformed Earth. The Ice Age had forced the first brutal sorting of survivors based on immediate adaptability. Now would come the longer, perhaps more difficult adaptation to a permanently altered planet. Those of us in the caves had survived the initial catastrophe, but survival wasn't the same as living. For humanity to truly continue, we would need to do more than endure the cold. We would need to build something new from the frozen remnants of the world we had lost. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of constant howling wind that penetrated even the insulated depths of the cave system. During that time, we maintained constant watch at the entrance, searching for any sign of Dr. Frost's group and their wolf companions. The entrance chamber had been prepared with medical supplies, warming equipment, and emergency rations, all standing ready for survivors who might never arrive. On the second day, the engineer who had sacrificed himself to repair the snow vehicle died despite the medical team's best efforts. Severe frostbite had progressed to systemic infection that couldn't be controlled, with our limited supplies of antibiotics. We held a brief memorial service in one of the deeper chambers, where a natural alcove served as a resting place. It was the cave's first funeral, but we all understood it wouldn't be the last. By the third day, hope for Dr. Frost's group had dwindled to almost nothing. No human could survive that long in the storm, regardless of preparation or guidance. Dr. Reed began the difficult process of reallocating the resources that had been set aside for them, his scientific pragmatism overriding emotional considerations. I found myself unable to accept their loss, maintaining solitary watches at the entrance long after others had returned to their assigned duties. It was during one such watch, as the storm finally began to subside, that movement appeared in the swirling snow, not human figures but the distinctive silhouettes of the adapted wolves. 3 of them emerged from the white haze, their thick fur encrusted with ice, moving with clear purpose toward the cave entrance. Behind them, barely visible, came the first human forms. I shouted for medical assistance and rushed to the entrance, where the temperature differential between cave and outside still created a dangerous transition zone. The wolves entered first, showing no fear of the human dwelling, immediately shaking ice from their coats and moving to the side to allow the humans' passage. Dr. Frost was among the first to enter, supporting another survivor who appeared severely frostbitten. 16, she gasped when I asked how many had survived the journey. Lost 4 in the whiteout. Wolves kept circling back, finding those who strayed, but sometimes we were too late. The medical team worked efficiently to move the survivors deeper into the cave system where geothermal warmth could begin the painful process of rewarming extremities. Most concerning were the psychological states, vacant expressions suggesting trauma beyond physical suffering, minimal verbal responses even to direct questions, bodily movements that appeared automatic rather than conscious. Dr. Frost alone maintained relative coherence, though even she exhibited signs of profound exhaustion and exposure. As we helped her to a recovery area, she clutched my arm with unexpected strength. "They knew the way," she whispered, glancing toward where the wolves had settled, allowing cave personnel to examine them with surprising docility. Not just toward the caves. They knew exactly which routes would be passable, which would be death traps. They've been here before. This statement made little sense given that the cave system had only been occupied by humans since shortly before the freeze began. When pressed, Dr. Frost explained what she had observed during their journey. how the wolves had moved with absolute certainty through terrain that appeared identical to human eyes, how they had avoided areas that later proved to be thin ice, over hidden water, how they had guided the group through passages that seemed to have been used repeatedly by the pack. It's as if they have generational memory of an ice age, she concluded. Behaviors that shouldn't exist without evolutionary timeframes to develop them. Dr. Reed, who had joined us during this explanation, exchanged significant glances with several of his scientific colleagues. He excused himself abruptly, returning to a restricted section of the cave system that housed their primary research, equipment and records. His reaction suggested Dr. Frost's observations had confirmed something they had already suspected, but not shared with the broader survivor community. Over the next 24 hours, as Dr. Frost's group was integrated into the cave's systems and routines, I observed concerning patterns in the scientists' behavior. Hushed conversations that ceased when others approached, increased activity in the restricted research section, additional security measures implemented around certain cave passages. Something had changed, and it involved more than just the arrival of new survivors. When I confronted Dr. Reed, his initial evasion quickly gave way to reluctant disclosure. The geothermal cave system had been known to his research team long before the magnetic anomalies appeared. In fact, it was the reason they had been in the region initially. The caves contain evidence of previous catastrophic cooling events, he explained, leading me deeper into the restricted section. Not just the ice ages documented in conventional geology, but rapid onset events similar to what we're experiencing now. The evidence was preserved in the cave walls themselves, layers of sediment and ice cores that contained biological samples dating back hundreds of thousands of years. What made these samples extraordinary was their indication of evolutionary leaps that defied conventional understanding, species that appeared to have adapted to extreme conditions far more rapidly than natural selection should allow. The wolves aren't the only creatures exhibiting accelerated adaptation, Dr. Reed confirmed. We've documented similar changes in several species that survived the initial freeze. Metabolic alterations, behavioral shifts, even anatomical modifications that should require generations to develop. The implications were staggering. Either our understanding of evolution was fundamentally flawed, or something about this particular type of catastrophe triggered genetic expressions that would normally remain dormant. Dr. Reed's team had been studying this phenomenon when the current freeze began, giving them crucial advanced knowledge that allowed them to establish the cave sanctuary before communications and transportation completely failed. We didn't expect it to happen in our lifetimes, he admitted. The geological record suggested a cyclical pattern with thousands of years between events. Something accelerated this cycle, perhaps human activity, perhaps external factors we haven't identified. This revelation explained much about the cave's preparedness but raised more disturbing questions. If Dr. Reed's team had anticipated this catastrophe, why hadn't they warned the broader scientific community? How many people could have been saved if proper preparations had been implemented globally? When pressed on this point, Dr. Reed's expression hardened. We did warn them, published papers, presented at conferences, submitted reports to government agencies. We were dismissed as alarmists, our funding threatened, our reputations questioned. By the time the first measurable magnetic shifts occurred, it was already too late for large-scale evacuation or preparation. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent summons from the medical section. One of Dr. Frost's survivors had developed severe hypothermia complications, requiring immediate intervention. The available medical equipment was sophisticated by post-collapse standards but primitive compared to modern hospitals. Treatment options were limited and survival rates for severe exposure cases remained discouraging. As I observed the medical team's efforts, I noticed something unexpected. One of the wolves had positioned itself near the treatment area, exhibiting behavior that appeared almost concerned for the human patient. Dr. Frost, herself still recovering, confirmed my observation. They've formed bonds with specific individuals, she explained. This goes beyond the symbiotic relationship we initially established. It's as if they've accepted certain humans as pack members. This development could represent another evolutionary adaptation, interspecies cooperation as survival strategy. Throughout natural history, catastrophic events had occasionally produced unusual alliances between species that would normally compete or avoid each other. But the speed and depth of this particular bond was unprecedented in documented science. While the medical crisis was ultimately resolved, the incident highlighted a critical vulnerability in our sanctuary. Despite the relative safety and sustainable temperature of the cave system, our medical capabilities remained dangerously limited. Without access to proper pharmaceuticals, surgical equipment, and advanced diagnostic tools, conditions that would have been routinely treatable in the pre-freeze world now represented potential death sentences. Dr. Reed acknowledged this vulnerability when I raised it during a leadership council meeting established to integrate the new survivors into the cave's governance structure. His response was unexpected. "There's a research facility approximately 50 miles southeast of here," he said, indicating a location on their rudimentary map. Government installation, officially designated for geological studies, but actually focused on biological research. If it survived the initial freeze, it would contain medical supplies, advanced equipment, possibly even communication technology more sophisticated than what we have here. The possibility was tantalizing, but fraught with risk. 50 miles represented an enormous distance in this transformed world, requiring travel through uncharted frozen territory during uncertain weather conditions. The snow vehicle was beyond repair, its components salvaged for other uses within the cave system. Any expedition would need to proceed primarily on foot, carrying sufficient supplies for the journey, while allowing space to transport back whatever resources could be recovered. Despite these challenges, the potential benefits demanded serious consideration. Beyond medical supplies, the research facility might contain information crucial to long-term survival. Agricultural techniques for extreme environments, additional geological data about safe regions, perhaps even documentation of similar events in human history that could guide our adaptation efforts. A volunteer team began to form around the expedition concept, including myself as someone with extensive wilderness navigation experience, Dr. Frost for her knowledge of the adapted wolves and their potential assistance, and several of Dr. Reed's original research team who had knowledge of the facility's layout and security systems. The debate shifted from whether the journey should be attempted to how it could be accomplished with acceptable risk levels. The preparations consumed the next several days. Routes were planned using the limited geographical information available, accounting for potential shelter locations and known hazardous areas. Equipment was assembled from our meager supplies, with emphasis on cold weather survival gear and lightweight tools for accessing the facility, if its security systems remained active. Rations were calculated to sustain the expedition team with minimal margin for delays or unexpected circumstances. Throughout these preparations, I observed the wolves' behavior with increasing interest. They seemed aware of the impending journey, clustering around those who would be participating, particularly Dr. Frost. She interpreted their behavior as approval and anticipation, believing they intended to accompany and guide the expedition. Others were more skeptical, suggesting we were anthropomorphizing animal behavior that had simpler explanations. The night before our scheduled departure, I was conducting final equipment checks when Dr. Reed approached with an unexpected request. He led me to the deepest section of the restricted research area, an improvised laboratory where core samples and biological specimens were preserved in whatever containers could be adapted for the purpose. "There's something else at the research facility," he said after ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "Something potentially more valuable than medical supplies or technological equipment." What he described was almost beyond belief. A biological preservation vault containing embryonic samples and genetic material from thousands of species, including agricultural crops specifically engineered for extreme climate conditions. The facility had been established as a fail-safe for precisely the type of catastrophic event we were experiencing, part of a classified government program that had continued despite public funding cuts to climate research. If we can recover even a portion of those samples, we might have the means to reconstruct functioning ecosystems once we establish proper controlled environments, Dr. Reed explained. The alternative is watching species extinction accelerate until Earth becomes functionally sterile except for the few organisms that manage spontaneous adaptation. This revelation added a new dimension to the expedition's purpose, elevating it from a critical supply run to potentially a mission to preserve Earth's biodiversity for whatever future might emerge from this catastrophe. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the alternative, allowing irreplaceable genetic material to degrade or be destroyed, was unthinkable. The expedition departed at first light, if the grayish illumination that now constituted daylight could be called such. Our team consisted of 7 humans, myself, Dr. Frost, 2 of Dr. Reed's researchers, and 3 individuals with military or security backgrounds from among the airport survivors. We were accompanied by 4 of the adapted wolves who had made their intention to join us clear by refusing to be separated from Dr. Frost during final preparations. The initial phase of the journey was aided by relatively clear weather and the wolves' pathfinding abilities. They consistently identified routes that maximized protection from wind and avoided dangerous terrain features that would have been invisible under the snow cover without specialized equipment. Their sensory capabilities clearly exceeded human limitations, particularly in detecting thin ice or unstable snow formations that could trigger avalanches. By the end of the first day, we had covered approximately 12 miles, a remarkable pace given the conditions, but one that left all human members of the expedition physically exhausted. We established camp in a protected ravine, using techniques Dr. Frost's group had developed during their nomadic phase. Snow shelters augmented with minimal supplies from our packs, body heat conserved through close proximity, and small, efficient fires using special fuel mixtures developed by Dr. Reed's team. The wolves established a perimeter around our camp, taking turns at what could only be described as sentry duty. Their behavior continued to suggest intelligence and purposefulness beyond normal animal cognition, reinforcing Dr. Frost's theories about accelerated adaptation triggered by the catastrophic environmental change. The second day brought our first significant challenge, a massive ice field where violent winds had scoured the snow cover, leaving a glass-like surface that made walking nearly impossible without specialized equipment. Our limited supply of crampons and ice screws was insufficient for the entire group, forcing us to develop a relay system where equipped individuals created anchored safety lines for others to follow. Progress slowed dramatically, and the physical toll mounted as falls and minor injuries accumulated. The wolves, with their adapted paw structures that provided natural traction on ice, became critical to our advance, literally allowing us to harness ourselves to them on the most treacherous sections. By nightfall, we had added only 7 miles to our journey, falling behind the ambitious schedule we had established. The third day began with an ominous meteorological development, a distinctive cloud formation on the northwestern horizon that Dr. Frost immediately identified as preceding the same type of severe storm that had nearly killed her group during their journey to the caves. Based on her experience, we had approximately 36 hours before the system would overtake our position, insufficient time to reach the research facility, and certainly inadequate for a return journey to the caves. We needed shelter capable of withstanding extreme conditions, and we needed it within a day's march. The topographical maps we carried showed no natural features that would serve the purpose, and man-made structures in the region had likely been destroyed or buried during the initial freeze. It was one of the wolves that provided the solution. The largest of the 4, a male Dr. Frost had named Atlas, repeatedly left and returned to the group, clearly attempting to lead us in a specific direction that deviated from our planned route. After discussion and considering the approaching storm, we made the decision to follow his guidance, trusting in the wolves' demonstrated environmental awareness. Atlas led us on a seemingly erratic path for several hours, crossing ridgelines and descending into valleys that appeared identical to the surrounding terrain. Just as team members began questioning the decision to follow an animal rather than our maps and compasses, we crested a final ridge and saw it, a research outpost, nestled against a cliff face, partially buried in snow but with structural elements still clearly visible. This wasn't the government facility we had been seeking, but rather a smaller installation that Dr. Reed's researchers identified as an automated weather and geological monitoring station established years earlier. Its existence hadn't been included in our planning because such remote outposts were assumed to have failed during the initial freeze, their solar panels and backup power systems inadequate for the extreme conditions that followed. Yet as we approached, we observed indications that this particular station retained some functionality. A communication array on its roof was clear of snow, suggesting either recent maintenance or built-in heating elements that remained operational. Most promising was a ventilation outlet visibly emitting warm air, confirming that some internal systems remained active. The facility was locked but not security sealed like the main research installation would be. With basic tools, we gained entrance to find an interior that, while cold by normal standards, represented luxury compared to the external environment. Emergency lighting functioned on reduced power, and automated systems had maintained minimal temperature control to prevent equipment damage. Most valuable was the communication console, still drawing power from what appeared to be a geothermal tap similar to the cave system's energy source. The researchers immediately began attempting to activate the long-range communications equipment, while the rest of us secured the perimeter and established sustainable conditions within the facility. The wolves exhibited strange behavior upon entering the structure. Rather than the caution expected from wild animals encountering an artificial environment, they moved with familiarity, investigating specific areas as if searching for something or someone. Dr. Frost observed their behavior with growing excitement, theorizing that they had been here before, perhaps brought by researchers studying their unusual adaptations before the catastrophe fully developed. This theory gained credibility when we discovered specialized equipment in a secondary laboratory space, monitoring devices designed for tracking wildlife, including subcutaneous transmitter units of the type used in conservation research. If Dr. Frost was correct, these wolves might have been research subjects that escaped or were released when the freeze began, carrying with them not just genetic adaptations, but learned knowledge of human structures and technology. Our investigation of the facility was cut short by an urgent discovery from the communications team. They had managed to establish contact with another survivor outpost, located in what had been northern Montana. The connection was tenuous, subject to constant interference from magnetic anomalies, but allowed basic information exchange. What we learned was simultaneously encouraging and alarming. Multiple survivor communities had formed across the region, some in natural shelters like our cave system, others in retrofitted human structures with sustainable heat sources. Rudimentary networks had been established between some groups, allowing limited resource sharing and information exchange. This suggested human survival on a larger scale than we had dared hope. However, the Montana group also reported a new phenomenon that aligned disturbingly with the wolves' behavior and Dr. Reed's research. Accelerated adaptation wasn't limited to animals. Human survivors were exhibiting physiological changes, particularly children born after the freeze began. These changes included significantly increased cold tolerance, altered metabolic processes, and in some cases, physical characteristics, optimized for the new environment. Most concerning was their report of factionalism developing between those exhibiting adaptive traits and those who remained traditionally human. In some communities, this had already led to conflict over resource allocation and leadership, with adaptive individuals sometimes viewed as either superior or as no longer fully human, depending on the community's values. This information added new urgency to our mission to reach the main research facility. If human adaptation was occurring alongside animal evolution, the genetic and biological research preserved there might be crucial not just for preserving Earth's biodiversity, but for understanding humanity's own transformation in response to the catastrophe. As the storm approached, transforming the landscape outside into an increasingly hostile environment, we used the unexpected shelter to reorganize our plan. The outpost's computers contained more detailed mapping information than we had brought from the caves, allowing us to identify a more efficient route to the main research facility that might be navigable even during moderate storm conditions. More significantly, the outpost's storage included several sets of advanced cold weather gear, designed for scientific fieldwork in extreme conditions, far superior to our improvised equipment. With these resources, our prospects for completing the journey successfully improved dramatically, despite the approaching storm. The wolves' behavior continued to evolve during our stay at the outpost. They began interacting with specific technological elements, particularly the monitoring equipment. in ways that suggested not just familiarity but purpose. Dr. Frost observed them repeatedly activating a particular scanning device by pressing their bodies against its sensor plate, as if expecting some response or result. When she investigated the device's data storage, she discovered something remarkable. The system had been programmed to recognize specific microchip identifiers, including those implanted in these exact wolves. They weren't just random animals that had adapted to the cold. They were research subjects from a controlled study of accelerated adaptation, apparently released or escaped when the catastrophe began. This discovery reinforced Dr. Reed's theories about previous cycle events and suggested something even more profound. The current ice age might be part of a pattern that included not just climate oscillation, but coordinated biological response across multiple species. The wolves weren't just surviving the catastrophe, they were fulfilling an evolutionary role programmed into their genetics, activated by the specific environmental triggers of a rapid onset freeze. As we prepared to continue our journey to the main research facility, utilizing the window before the storm reached full intensity, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I understood about the catastrophe. What if this wasn't just a natural disaster or human-caused climate crisis? What if it was part of Earth's larger biological system, a reset mechanism that periodically reshuffled the evolutionary deck when certain thresholds were crossed? The implications of such a system would transform our understanding of our place on this planet. Humans might not be the culmination of evolution, but merely one expression of life that rises and falls within these great cycles, sometimes dominant, sometimes marginal, always subject to the same adaptive pressures as every other species. With these profound questions weighing on my mind, I led our expedition out of the temporary sanctuary of the outpost and back into the frozen world, now better equipped, but facing weather conditions that continued to deteriorate. The main research facility lay approximately 30 miles ahead, a distance that represented not just physical challenge but potentially a journey toward understanding humanity's future in this transformed world. The wolves took point position without prompting, moving with purpose toward our destination, occasionally looking back as if to ensure we were following correctly. Their confidence bolstered our own, creating an unusual dynamic where humans willingly followed animal guidance through terrain that would have been navigable. As the first heavy snowfall of the approaching storm began to reduce visibility, I reflected on how quickly our relationship with these creatures had evolved from the traditional human-animal hierarchy to something approaching partnership between different forms of intelligence. Perhaps this too was part of the adaptive pattern, species learning to combine their strengths rather than compete when faced with existential threat. The question that remained unanswered was whether such cooperation would be enough to ensure human survival through this catastrophic transition, or whether our species, like so many before us, would become merely another layer in the geological record, evidence of a form of life that failed to adapt when Earth entered a new phase of its endless cycles. The journey from the weather station to the main research facility was unlike anything I had experienced even in this transformed world. The storm intensified more rapidly than predicted, reducing visibility to mere feet despite our improved equipment. The temperature dropped so severely that our breath froze instantly, creating ice crystals on our face masks that required constant removal to maintain airflow. Without the wolves, we would have become disoriented and lost within the first hour. They moved with absolute certainty through conditions that rendered human senses nearly useless, frequently circling back to guide stragglers or indicate hazards invisible beneath the snow. Their behavior continued to suggest intelligence far beyond normal animal cognition, reinforcing Dr. Frost's theories about accelerated adaptation. We covered approximately 15 miles the first day after leaving the weather station, making better progress than expected despite the deteriorating conditions. The advanced cold weather gear provided superior insulation and mobility, though even it had limitations against the unprecedented cold. When we established camp for the night, the wolves arranged themselves in a protective formation around our shelters, taking shifts at watchfulness that mimicked human sentry patterns. During that night, I witnessed something that fundamentally altered my understanding of what was happening to our world. Unable to sleep despite exhaustion, I moved to the entrance of our shelter to check conditions, expecting the same swirling white darkness that had accompanied us throughout the day. Instead, I saw the wolves gathered in a tight circle a short distance away, bodies oriented inward, communicating through what appeared to be deliberate vocalizations and body movements. This wasn't the random interaction of animals sheltering together for warmth. It had structure, sequence, apparent meaning. When Atlas, the largest male, noticed my observation, he broke from the circle and approached me directly. His gaze held mine with unsettling intentionality before he turned, clearly expecting me to follow him a short distance from camp. What? He showed me defied explanation within conventional understanding of animal behavior. Using his paws and muzzle, he cleared snow from a particular area, revealing ice with unusual coloration beneath. When I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized I was looking at perfectly preserved plant material embedded in clear ice, flowers and grasses that shouldn't exist in this region naturally, appearing to have been frozen instantly at the height of growth. More shocking was their appearance, structural adaptations for extreme cold that botanical science had theorized but never documented in living specimens. These plants had thrived in Ice Age conditions, with specialized cellular structures visible even to the naked eye. When I looked questioningly at Atlas, he moved to another location and repeated the process, revealing different plant species with similar adaptations. I understood then what he was communicating. This wasn't the first time such plants had grown here. Previous ice ages had generated similar adaptations, followed by thaws where the evidence was lost except in rare preservation conditions like this. The cycle Atlas was illustrating wasn't just about survival during cold. It was about transformation and renewal, about life continuing in altered forms rather than simply enduring until conditions reversed. I shared this discovery with Dr. Frost when morning came, expecting scientific skepticism. Instead, she revealed similar observations during her time with the wolf pack, including their apparent ability to locate preserved biological material beneath snow and ice. What had seemed random behavior during their nomadic phase now appeared purposeful. They had been cataloging biological data across the transformed landscape, creating a mental map of what had survived and in what form. The implication was staggering. These wolves weren't just adapted physically to the new conditions, they were functioning as biological archivists, preserving knowledge crucial for whatever came after this freeze. Whether this behavior was instinctive, learned, or the result of the research they had been part of before release remained unclear, but its significance for our mission was profound. We continued toward the main research facility with renewed urgency, understanding that what we might find there wasn't just critical for immediate survival, but potentially for comprehending the larger patterns at work in Earth's biological systems. The storm reached peak intensity during this phase of our journey, forcing periods of complete immobility where we could only shelter in place and wait for temporary clearings that allowed forward progress. On the afternoon of the third day after leaving the weather station, Atlas and another wolf suddenly altered their behavior, becoming agitated and changing direction repeatedly. Dr. Frost interpreted this as confusion about our route, but I suspected something more concerning: interference with whatever sensory mechanisms allowed them to navigate so effectively through the storm. This theory proved correct when we crested a ridge and saw the research facility for the first time, a complex of low buildings partially buried in snow, but distinguished by a perimeter of cleared ground where snow appeared unable to accumulate. More alarming were the visible security measures, automated defense systems clearly still active, and evidence of recent human activity including cleared pathways and maintained equipment. The facility hadn't been abandoned during the initial freeze. Someone or some group had maintained occupation, utilizing its resources for survival while apparently continuing research activities. This dramatically complicated our mission to access the medical supplies and biological preservation vault. What should have been a salvage operation now potentially involved negotiation or conflict with unknown occupants. We established observation, position at a safe distance, using optical equipment from the weather station to assess activity patterns and security vulnerabilities. Over several hours, We confirmed the presence of approximately 15 individuals moving between buildings, all wearing distinctive uniform-like cold-weather gear marked with insignia we couldn't identify at this distance. The wolves exhibited increasing discomfort the longer we remained in proximity to the facility. They paced restlessly, frequently looking northward, as if expecting something to appear from that direction. Their behavior suggested not fear of the facility itself but anxiety about our extended exposure in this location, reinforcing my growing sense that they perceived threats beyond immediate human comprehension. After extended observation and team discussion, we developed an approach strategy. Rather than attempting covert entry, which would likely trigger automated systems we couldn't predict, we would initiate formal contact using communication protocols Dr. Reed's researchers were familiar with. If the facility occupants were scientists continuing their work, they might welcome additional personnel and expertise. If they were military or government forces maintaining security around sensitive, research official identification codes might prevent immediate hostility. We selected a 3-person contact team. Myself as someone with government contracting experience who understood bureaucratic communication patterns. One of Dr. Reed's researchers, who knew facility layouts and protocols, and a former military member from the airport survivors who could recognize and respond appropriately to security procedures. The remaining team members would maintain observation position with contingency plans for both success and failure scenarios. The wolves presented an additional complication. Their obvious intelligence and potential connection to the facility's research made them valuable to our approach, but their appearance might trigger defensive responses from occupants unfamiliar with their adapted state. After consideration, Dr. Frost convinced us that Atlas should accompany the contact team, with the other wolves remaining at observation position under her guidance. Our approach to the facility was deliberately slow and visible, with communication equipment broadcasting recognized emergency frequencies used by government research operations. We stopped at the perimeter of the cleared ground, maintaining non-threatening posture while continuing transmission. Atlas positioned, himself slightly behind our group, visible but not prominently featured, his behavior suggesting understanding of the delicate situation. The response came after approximately 20 minutes of transmission, a voice over shortwave requesting identification and purpose. We provided the information prepared with Dr. Reed's guidance, emphasizing our connection to legitimate research and our knowledge of the facility's general purpose, without revealing specific awareness of the biological vault. Another 10 minutes passed before a gate in the perimeter fence opened, and 3 figures emerged, approaching our position with evident caution. They wore the same distinctive cold-weather gear we had observed earlier, now identifiable as modified, military-grade equipment with scientific division insignia, rather than traditional armed forces markings. They carried weapons but maintained non-aggressive posture, suggesting defensive rather than offensive intent. The lead figure identified himself as Dr. James Harlow, research director for what he called continuity operations at the facility. His initial questions focused on our origin point, group composition, and how we had managed to survive the freeze and locate the facility. When I mentioned the cave system and Dr. Reed's name, his demeanor shifted noticeably toward increased openness. "Reed's team made it," he said with evident relief. "We lost contact with all auxiliary research stations when the primary communications grid failed. Your arrival represents the first confirmation that organized scientific operations survived outside dedicated facilities." The conversation became more substantive as mutual credibility was established. Dr. Harlow explained that the facility had been designed specifically to maintain operations through catastrophic climate events, with geothermal power, extensive supply caches, and research capabilities focused on biological preservation and adaptation strategies. What they lacked was field data about conditions beyond their sensor range and information about survivor populations that might benefit from their resources. When Atlas finally moved forward to join our conversation directly, Dr. Harlow's reaction was illuminating. Not surprise, but recognition. "Subject Alpha 7, he said, kneeling to examine the wolf more closely. "We assumed all research subjects were lost when the containment systems failed during the initial magnetic surge. His pack has survived then. This confirmation of the wolves' research connection led to rapid expansion of trust between our groups. Dr. Harlow invited our contact team inside the facility perimeter for preliminary briefing while arrangements were made to bring the remainder of our expedition group from their observation position. The wolves, he assured us, were welcome and in fact represented valuable research assets whose unexpected survival and continued development were of significant scientific interest. Inside the facility's main research building, we experienced true climate control for the first time since the freeze began, not just above freezing temperatures, but actual warmth that allowed removal of our heavy protective gear. The psychological impact of this simple comfort after weeks of constant cold stress was profound, momentarily overwhelming even our mission focus and security concerns. The briefing that followed revealed both encouraging capabilities and disturbing implications. The facility was indeed a biological preservation vault containing genetic material from thousands of species, including agricultural varieties engineered for extreme climate conditions. It also maintained medical facilities far beyond anything available at the cave system, with pharmaceutical production capabilities that could address many of our most pressing health concerns. However, the research being conducted went beyond preservation to active manipulation of genetic material, focused specifically on accelerated adaptation. Dr. Harlow's team had been working on this before the catastrophe, studying previous evidence of rapid evolutionary response to climate shifts. When the magnetic anomalies began signaling imminent disaster, they expanded their work to include application rather than just theory. The wolves were our first success, Dr. Harlow explained. Canids have genetic structures particularly responsive to directed adaptation. We identified markers from previous cold cycle species and activated them in modern wolves, essentially awakening dormant evolutionary pathways. The ethical implications of such research would have been controversial in the pre-freeze world. In our new reality, they seemed almost irrelevant compared to survival imperatives. More concerning was Dr. Harlow's revelation about what they had discovered through continued observation of magnetic patterns after the initial freeze. This isn't just a climate event, he said, displaying data that outlined patterns invisible to conventional meteorology. The magnetic disruption is reorganizing energy distribution across the planet's surface. Areas that were temperate are now Arctic. But conversely, some previously uninhabitable regions are developing microclimate stability that could support adapted life forms. This information aligned with what Atlas had shown me, evidence of plant life specifically evolved for Ice Age conditions. The Earth wasn't simply freezing uniformly, it was reorganizing its biosphere around new energy distribution patterns, creating niches where adapted life could flourish while conventional ecosystems collapsed. Most significant for our immediate concerns was Dr. Harlow's confirmation that controlled adaptation techniques developed for animal subjects could be modified for human application. His team had already begun preliminary work on treatments that could enhance human cold tolerance, metabolic efficiency, and sensory acuity under extreme conditions. The ethical boundaries of the pre-collapse world had been replaced by survival imperatives in the face of extinction threat. "We need field testing," he explained. "Laboratory results are promising, but real-world application requires subjects already living in the transformed environment. Your people from the cave system represent ideal candidates, already selected for survival traits by natural pressures, with established community structures that can be monitored for social adaptation, alongside physiological changes." The proposition was simultaneously hopeful and disturbing, potential salvation through directed evolution, but at the cost of fundamentally altering what it means to be human. Would enhanced individuals still consider themselves the same species as non-modified humans? Would distinct subspecies emerge, adapted to different environmental niches in the transformed world? These philosophical questions were temporarily set aside as we addressed immediate practical concerns. After full briefing, our expedition team coordinated with facility personnel to assemble medical supplies, adaptation research materials, and biological preservation samples for transport back to the cave system. Dr. Harlow committed to establishing a regular exchange route between the facilities, creating a research corridor that could eventually expand to include other survivor communities. The wolves were integrated into this plan as critical components rather than merely guides. Their demonstrated navigation abilities in extreme conditions would establish the foundation for a transportation network between isolated human populations. More significantly, study of their successful adaptation provided templates for treatments that might help humans survive the deepening freeze. As preparations for our return journey neared completion, Atlas exhibited behavior suggesting urgency about departure timing. He repeatedly oriented northward, vocalizing in patterns Dr. Frost interpreted as warning rather than mere agitation. When facility sensors detected another approaching storm system, we realized the wolf had been sensing its approach long before our technology confirmed it. This storm would be more severe than any previously recorded since the freeze began. Satellite imagery still accessible through the facility's dedicated systems showed atmospheric conditions consolidating into what meteorologists would have called a polar vortex, but on a scale unprecedented in recorded climate history. Temperatures in its core approached absolute thermodynamic limits for Earth's atmosphere, with wind speeds capable of stripping exposed skin instantly. Our return journey needed to depart immediately, or risk being trapped at the facility for potentially weeks while the cave community awaited critical supplies. The decision was complicated by Dr. Harlow's recommendation that he accompany us with a small research team, bringing additional equipment too sensitive to entrust to others. This would expand our group size beyond initial planning and potentially slow our movement. The wolves provided unexpected resolution to this dilemma. Under Atlas's apparent leadership, they located specialized transport sleds in the facility's equipment storage, designed for moving sensitive materials across snow and ice. With these sleds loaded and harnessed to the wolves in configurations they seemed to understand instinctively, our carrying capacity and movement speed increased significantly. We departed the facility less than 12 hours after initial contact, now expanded to 14 humans and 6 wolves, 2 additional animals having joined from the facility's research population. The transportation array resembled Arctic expeditions from the previous century, but with critical technological improvements in materials and design. Most importantly, we carried hope in both tangible form, medical supplies and preservation samples, and conceptual form, potential adaptation, pathways that might ensure human survival through the catastrophe. The return journey began promisingly, with clear weather and the wolves' navigation allowing efficient path selection. We covered nearly 20 miles the first day, maintaining pace that would return us to the cave system before the massive storm system arrived from the north. The mood among expedition members was cautiously optimistic, focused on the potential benefits our mission would bring to the larger survivor community. That optimism was challenged during our second day of return travel. One of the facility researchers detected anomalous energy readings from the direction we were traveling, consistent with the magnetic disruptions that had triggered the initial freeze but localized rather than global. The implications were concerning. These patterns suggested the transformation of Earth's energy systems was continuing, rather than stabilizing, potentially creating new hazards in areas previously navigable. The wolves confirmed this concern through behavior changes that indicated growing anxiety about our route. They began suggesting alternatives through their movement patterns, often trying to lead us more southerly than our planned approach to the caves. After consultation between Dr. Frost, Dr. Harlow, and the technical specialists, we made the difficult decision to follow the wolves' guidance rather than maintaining our original course. This decision proved life-saving when we crested a ridge and saw what lay in our original path, a vast chasm that had not existed during our outbound journey, apparently formed by seismic activity triggered by the ongoing magnetic disruptions. The terrain we had safely crossed days earlier had been literally torn apart by forces reorganizing the planet's geological structures alongside its climate patterns. More alarming was what we observed at the chasm's edges: ice formations, with structural patterns that defied conventional crystallization physics, growing and reshaping themselves in visible motion rather than through gradual accretion. The facility researchers recognized these formations from theoretical models of extreme climate transition phases, but had never expected to observe them directly in the field. The planetary systems are still seeking equilibrium, Dr. Harlow, explained as we observed the formations from safe distance. Energy redistribution on this scale creates intermediate states that conventional physics doesn't adequately describe. We're witnessing the boundary conditions between stable climate regimes. This discovery reinforced the urgency of returning to the cave system with our research materials. If the planet's transformation was continuing rather than stabilizing, adaptation strategies needed immediate implementation rather than careful testing. The theoretical risks of accelerated human modification seemed insignificant compared to the demonstrated instability of our environment. The wolves guided us along an alternative route that added distance but avoided the unstable terrain, their behavior suggesting intimate knowledge of the changing landscape that surpassed even their demonstrated navigation abilities. Dr. Frost's observation that they were functioning as biological archivists gained credibility, as they consistently led us to areas where preserved biological material could be observed beneath the ice, creating an apparent catalog of adaptation examples relevant to our journey. We maintained communication with the research facility using portable equipment, reporting our observations of terrain transformation, and receiving updated satellite data about the approaching storm system. The exchange of information created a feedback loop of growing concern. Our field observations confirmed the facility's theoretical models of accelerating change, while their atmospheric data indicated conditions deteriorating more rapidly than predicted. The final day of our return journey became a race against both the approaching storm and the continuing transformation of the landscape. The wolves maintained relentless pace, demonstrating endurance beyond what should have been physiologically possible given their size and the energy demands of extreme cold. The humans struggled to match their pace despite our advanced equipment, eventually requiring rotation systems where stronger team members temporarily carried equipment for those showing exhaustion. When the cave system finally came into view, the relief was palpable but brief. The approaching storm had generated atmospheric effects visible even at horizon distance. Unnatural cloud formations with electrical discharges unlike normal lightning, moving with patterns suggesting intelligence rather than mere weather dynamics. We were witnessing the visible manifestation of Earth's magnetic field reorganizing itself, creating energy expressions beyond our experience or scientific understanding. The cave entrance had been prepared for our return, with Dr. Reed's team maintaining constant watch despite the approaching danger. Their greeting was both joyful and urgent as they helped transport our precious cargo deeper into the cave system, where geothermal stability would protect it from the approaching chaos. The wolves entered without hesitation, now apparently comfortable in the human dwelling they had helped locate. As the storm reached the cave system, its effects penetrated even the insulated depths where most survivors had established living quarters. Electromagnetic fluctuations disrupted electronic equipment, strange harmonic resonances vibrated through the rock itself, and temperature patterns shifted unpredictably despite distance from the surface. These phenomena confirmed Dr. Harlow's assessment that we were experiencing not just weather, but fundamental reorganization of Earth's energy systems. In the days that followed, as the storm gradually subsided, we established new operational structures integrating the research facilities, personnel, and knowledge with the cave community's practical experience. Medical treatments began for those most affected by cold exposure and nutritional deficiencies. Communication systems were enhanced using components from the facility, creating potential for contact with other survivor groups when conditions permitted. Most significantly, controlled adaptation procedures were introduced on voluntary basis, beginning with treatments that enhanced cold tolerance and metabolic efficiency without visible physical changes. The results were promising: improved survival capabilities without immediate social disruption or identity crises among recipients. The more substantial modifications that would create truly cold-adapted humans remained theoretical, awaiting broader community discussion and ethical consensus. The wolves continued their integration into our community, establishing patterns of cooperation that transcended traditional human-animal relationships. Their cognitive abilities appeared to be still developing, with communication complexities increasing as they interacted with humans who recognized and responded to their intelligence. They were neither pets nor work animals but genuine partners in survival, representing perhaps the first truly cooperative cross-species community in human history. 1 month after the initial freeze, our situation remained precarious, but no longer hopeless. The cave system housed approximately 80 humans with sustainable resources for the foreseeable future. The research facility maintained operations with reduced personnel, focusing on long-term adaptation strategies and communication with any government continuity operations that might have survived globally. Regular exchange between locations had been established using adapted transportation methods developed through wolf-human cooperation. Most importantly, we had begun to understand our catastrophe not as an ending, but as a transition, difficult, deadly, but ultimately part of Earth's longer rhythms, the biological evidence preserved in ice, the adapted species emerging in real time, and the genetic memory expressed in creatures like the wolves, all suggested we were experiencing not random disaster, but organized planetary response to critical system thresholds being crossed. As a helicopter pilot who had once observed wildlife from safe aerial distance, I now found myself grounded, but paradoxically more connected to the biological systems around me. My perspective had shifted from observer to participant in an evolutionary process that operated on scales usually invisible to human perception. The skills that had once made me valuable for tracking wolf migrations now served a different purpose, helping navigate the migration of humanity itself into whatever new form would emerge from this planetary transformation. The auroras continued to appear nightly, no longer mysterious or frightening but recognized as visible expressions of the energy reorganization reshaping our world. Their beauty remained, but now contextualized within understanding rather than fear. They had been warning and witness to the Ice Age's arrival. Now they served as reminder that even in transformation, patterns persist and life continues, adapted to whatever conditions emerge from chaos. The world isn't ending. It's just changing into something else. And so are we. But there's something emerging from this transformation that might represent more than mere survival. A new relationship between humans and the planetary systems we inhabit, between our species and others, sharing this transitional moment. In the ice, we may have found not just challenge but opportunity to evolve beyond the limitations that brought us to this threshold. I've begun documenting strange new animal migration patterns visible from our highest observation points, coordinated movements that suggest communication and purpose beyond traditional species boundaries. Tomorrow, Atlas and I will fly out in a newly adapted aircraft designed for the transformed atmospheric conditions, seeking the source of these migration patterns and whatever they might reveal about the future taking shape beneath the ice. The journey that began with desperate escape from freezing chaos now continues as exploration of a new Earth still being born around us.